In the dead of night, when most people sleep peacefully in their beds, some face moments that define their entire existence. Sarah Martinez never imagined that a simple trip to the mess hall would become the night that tested every fiber of her being. What started as hunger pangs at 2 a.m. turned into a life-or-death situation that would expose the darkest corners of military training and reveal the extraordinary strength that lies within ordinary people. Sometimes the most powerful acts of courage don't happen on battlefields or in burning buildings. Sometimes they happen in quiet moments when someone decides that enough is enough, when they choose to stand up even when a loaded weapon is pointed directly at their head. This is the story of how one young cadet's refusal to back down didn't just save her own life, but sparked a revolution that would change an entire military base forever. What she did next shocked everyone who witnessed it, and what happened afterward proves that sometimes the smallest person in the room can be the one with the biggest impact on history. Sarah Martinez had always been small for her age, but what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination. At 19 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in the regulation bun that all female cadets were required to wear. Her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that most people missed at first glance, but those who looked closer could see the steel beneath the surface. The military academy had been her dream since childhood. Growing up in a small town in Texas, Sarah had watched her older brother struggle with direction after high school, bouncing from job to job with no clear purpose. She was determined to be different. The structure, discipline, and honor of military service called to something deep inside her. Her parents had been hesitant at first, worried about their youngest daughter entering such a demanding world. But they eventually supported her decision when they saw how passionate she was about serving her country. Fort Davidson Military Academy was known for its rigorous training programs and high standards. Located in the mountains of Colorado, the base housed over 3,000 cadets from across the nation. The facility was massive, with dormitories, training grounds, administrative buildings, and dining facilities spread across hundreds of acres of rugged terrain. The academy prided itself on producing some of the finest officers in the military, and the training reflected that ambition. Sarah had arrived at the academy 6 months earlier, filled with excitement and nervous energy. The first few weeks had been brutal as expected. The physical training was intense, the academic requirements demanding, and the social dynamics complex. She quickly learned that the academy operated on an unofficial hierarchy that went far beyond the formal rank structure. Senior cadets wielded considerable power over newcomers, and that power wasn't always used responsibly. The hazing had started subtly. Senior cadets would make snide comments about her height, questioning whether someone so small belonged in the military. They would assign her extra cleaning duties, claiming her work wasn't up to standard. During physical training, they would pair her with much larger opponents, watching with amusement as she struggled to keep up. Sarah endured it all without complaint, knowing that speaking up would only make things worse. But as weeks turned to months, the treatment became more aggressive. A group of senior cadets led by an imposing young man named Marcus Reed seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting Sarah. Reed was everything Sarah wasn't, tall, broad-shouldered, and confident to the point of arrogance. He came from a military family with a long tradition of service, and he wore that heritage like armor. His father was a decorated colonel, and Reed never let anyone forget it. Reed's group consisted of 5 other senior cadets who followed his lead without question. There was Jake Morrison, a former high school football star who used his size to intimidate others. Tommy Chen, whose quiet demeanor masked a cruel streak that emerged when he was with the group. Lisa Hartwell, one of the few female seniors who seemed to enjoy the power that came with tormenting younger cadets. David Brooks, whose family wealth had bought him privileges that others had to earn. And finally, Alex Kumar, who participated reluctantly but never had the courage to stand up to Reed. The group had made Sarah's life increasingly difficult. They would accidentally spill food on her uniform, forcing her to change and making her late for formations. They would hide her equipment before inspections, resulting in demerits and extra punishment duties. During training exercises, they would sabotage her efforts, then act innocent when instructors questioned the results. Sarah tried to document the harassment, keeping a careful record of incidents in a journal hidden in her footlocker. She knew that reporting the behavior through official channels would require evidence, and she was determined to build a solid case. But she also knew that speaking out too early, without ironclad proof, could backfire spectacularly. The unwritten code of the academy protected senior cadets, and accusations without overwhelming evidence were often dismissed or, worse, resulted in retaliation against the accuser. The stress was taking its toll. Sarah's grades remained strong, but her sleep suffered. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering when the next prank would occur. Her appetite decreased, and she began skipping meals to avoid confrontations in the dining hall. Her parents noticed the change during their weekly phone calls, expressing concern about the strain in her voice and the weight she was losing. Despite everything, Sarah refused to quit. She had worked too hard to get to the academy, and she wasn't about to let a group of bullies drive her away. She threw herself into her studies and training with even greater intensity, determined to prove that she belonged. Her instructors began to notice her dedication, and several commented on her potential as a future leader. The academy's daily routine was structured and predictable. Reveille sounded at 500 hours every morning, followed by physical training, breakfast, classes, more training, dinner, study time, and lights out at 2200 hours. Meals were served at specific times in the main dining facility, a cavernous hall that could accommodate over 1,000 cadets at once. The kitchen staff worked around the clock to keep the facility supplied with food, but late-night options were limited. Cadets were technically allowed to visit the dining facility outside of regular meal times, but doing so required navigating the unofficial social rules that governed academy life. New cadets were expected to ask permission from seniors before taking such liberties, and permission was often denied for arbitrary reasons. The late-night kitchen was considered senior cadet territory, and younger cadets who ventured there without approval were asking for trouble. Sarah had learned these unwritten rules the hard way. Early in her time at the academy, she had attempted to grab a late snack after a particularly grueling study session, only to be confronted by a group of seniors who made it clear that she was not welcome. Since then, she had been careful to eat during regular meal times, even when her schedule made it difficult. But on this particular night in March, circumstances converged in a way that would change everything. Sarah had been working on a complex engineering project that was due the following morning. The assignment was worth 30% of her grade in her most challenging course, and she couldn't afford anything less than perfection. She had been in the library since dinner, poring over calculations and diagrams, completely absorbed in her work. By the time she realized how late it had gotten, the library was nearly empty. The clock on the wall showed 1:45 hours, well past the official study time. Her stomach was growling loudly, and she realized she hadn't eaten since lunch earlier that day. The stress of the project and her ongoing troubles with Reed's group had suppressed her appetite during dinner, and now her body was demanding fuel. Sarah packed up her materials and headed back to her dormitory, but the hunger pangs were becoming impossible to ignore. She knew there might be some snacks in her room, but a quick mental inventory revealed only a few crackers and some fruit that was probably past its prime. The thought of trying to focus on her project with an empty stomach was daunting, especially when she still had several hours of work ahead of her. Standing outside her dormitory building, Sarah weighed her options. She could try to make do with whatever food she had in her room, knowing it wouldn't be enough to sustain her through the rest of the night. She could give up on finishing the project and hope that a partial submission would be enough to pass the course, though she knew that wasn't realistic given her current grade in the class. Or she could risk a trip to the dining facility and hope that the late hour would mean fewer people around to cause problems. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah had never been one to give up when faced with challenges, and she wasn't about to start now. She needed food to fuel her brain for the work ahead, and she was tired of letting fear of confrontation control her actions. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her uniform and began walking toward the dining facility. The base was quiet at this hour, with only a few lights visible in windows where other dedicated students were burning the midnight oil. The security patrols were predictable, and Sarah timed her route to avoid them. It wasn't that she was breaking any rules by being out. She had legitimate reasons for her late-night activities, but she preferred to avoid unnecessary questions or delays. The dining facility was a large, institutional building that looked imposing in the darkness. Most of the lights were off, but Sarah could see a faint glow coming from the kitchen area where the night staff was preparing for the next day's breakfast service. The main dining hall was dark and empty, filled with rows of tables and chairs that looked ghostly in the dim emergency lighting. Sarah made her way to the serving area, hoping to find some leftover food or at least something simple like bread and fruit. The kitchen staff was busy with prep work and paid little attention to her presence, which was exactly what she had hoped for. She managed to find a sandwich and some fruit, along with a carton of milk and a bag of chips. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it would provide the energy she needed to finish her project. She was heading toward a table in the corner of the dining hall, planning to eat quickly and get back to work, when she heard voices coming from the far end of the room. Her heart sank as she recognized the distinctive laugh of Marcus Reed. She had thought the late hour would protect her from encounters with his group, but apparently some of them were also making use of the 24-hour access to the facility. Sarah considered retreating, but she was already halfway across the dining hall and carrying a tray of food. Any sudden movements would only draw attention to her presence. Instead, she continued toward her chosen table, hoping they wouldn't notice her in the dim lighting. She had almost made it to safety when Reed's voice rang out across the hall. "Well, well, well, look what we have here. The little mouse has come out to play." Sarah's blood ran cold as she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She set her tray down on the table and turned to face Reed and his companions. In the low light, they looked even more intimidating than usual, their faces partially shadowed and their expressions hard to read. Reed was in the lead, with Morrison and Chen flanking him on either side. Hartwell hung back slightly, but Sarah could see the anticipation in her posture. "You know, Martinez," Reed said, his voice carrying easily in the empty dining hall, "I thought we had discussed the rules about late-night kitchen privileges. This area is reserved for senior cadets after hours. Didn't anyone explain that to you?" Sarah's mind raced as she considered her response. She knew that Reed was making up rules on the spot. There was no official policy restricting access to the dining facility based on class year. But she also knew that arguing the point would only escalate the situation. The smart move would be to apologize, abandon her food, and leave quietly. But something deep inside Sarah rebelled against that option. She was tired of being pushed around, tired of having to constantly look over her shoulder, tired of letting bullies control her actions. She had as much right to be in the dining facility as anyone else, and she was not going to be intimidated into giving up that right. "I'm not aware of any such rule," Sarah said calmly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "The dining facility is available to all cadets 24 hours a day according to the Academy handbook. I'm just getting something to eat so I can finish my coursework." Reed's expression darkened at her response. He clearly hadn't expected her to stand her ground, and her calm demeanor seemed to irritate him further. He took a step closer, using his height advantage to loom over her. "Is that so?" Reed said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Well, maybe it's time someone taught you about the real rules around here, the ones that matter more than what's written in some handbook." The other cadets moved to form a loose circle around Sarah, effectively trapping her against the table. She could feel her pulse quickening, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would only make the situation worse, and she needed to think clearly if she was going to find a way out of this confrontation. "I don't want any trouble," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "I just want to eat my food and get back to my studies. There's no reason this has to become a problem." Reed laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, but it already is a problem, Martinez. You see, respect is something that has to be earned around here, and disrespecting your seniors by ignoring their rules is not the way to earn it." Sarah could see where this was heading, and she knew she had to make a decision. She could back down now, apologize profusely, and hope that would be enough to satisfy Reed's ego. It would mean abandoning her food and accepting another humiliation, but it would likely end the immediate confrontation. Alternatively, she could continue to stand her ground and risk escalating the situation into something much more serious. The choice was made for her when Reed reached out and knocked her tray of food to the floor. The sound of the plate shattering echoed through the empty dining hall, and milk spread across the linoleum in a white puddle. Sarah stared at the mess for a moment, feeling a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "That was unnecessary," she said, her voice now carrying a harder edge. "You've made your point, I'll leave." But Reed wasn't finished. "Oh no, Martinez, you don't get to just walk away now. You've shown disrespect to your seniors and that requires correction. I think some push-ups are in order, let's say 50 to start with." Sarah looked around the circle of faces surrounding her. She could see the anticipation in their eyes, the expectation that she would comply with Reed's arbitrary punishment. Part of her wanted to just get down and do the push-ups, to get this over with and move on. But a larger part of her realized that giving in now would only invite more abuse in the future. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Reed's face flushed with anger, and Sarah could see his hands clenching into fists. She had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, and both of them knew it. "What did you say?" Reed asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I said no," Sarah repeated, louder this time. "I'm not doing push-ups for you or anyone else. I haven't broken any rules, and I don't recognize your authority to punish me." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears and the distant sounds of the kitchen staff working in the next room. She knew that she had just made a decision that would have consequences far beyond this moment, but she also knew that it was the right decision. She was tired of being a victim. Reed's face turned red with rage at Sarah's defiance. In the months since he had arrived at the academy, no junior cadet had ever dared to refuse a direct order from him. His reputation as someone not to be crossed was built on the fear and compliance of younger students, and Sarah's simple word had just shattered that carefully constructed image in front of his followers. "You think you're tough, Martinez," Reed snarled, stepping so close that Sarah could feel his breath on her face. "You think because you've managed to survive a few months here that you're one of us? Let me tell you something about how things really work at this academy." Morrison moved closer, cracking his knuckles in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing nearly 250 pounds, he had used his physical presence to cow many younger cadets into submission. But Sarah didn't flinch, even as his shadow fell over her small frame. "You see, there are 2 sets of rules here," Reed continued, beginning to pace around Sarah like a predator circling its prey. "There are the official rules that they write in the handbooks and post on the bulletin boards. Those are for the administrators and the visiting parents and the politicians who fund this place. But then there are the real rules, the ones that actually matter. And the most important real rule is that seniors get respect from juniors, no matter what." Chen stepped forward from his position near the entrance, effectively cutting off Sarah's easiest path of escape. His normally quiet demeanor had been replaced by something harder and more menacing. Sarah realized that she was now completely surrounded, with no clear way to leave without pushing through one of the cadets blocking her path. "The problem is," Reed said, stopping directly in front of Sarah again, "you seem to think that the official rules are the only ones that matter. You think that because some handbook says you can be here, that means you're welcome here. But you're wrong, dead wrong." Hartwell spoke up for the first time since the confrontation began. "Maybe she needs a more direct lesson in academy traditions," she suggested, her voice carrying a cruel edge. "Something that will help her remember her place." Sarah's mind was racing, calculating her options and finding them all problematic. The dining hall was isolated at this hour, with only the kitchen staff present, and they were far enough away that they likely couldn't hear what was happening unless someone started shouting. The nearest security patrol wouldn't be through this area for another 20 minutes, according to her mental map of their schedule. She could try to make a run for it, but Chen was blocking the main exit, and Morrison was positioned to intercept her if she tried to circle around the tables. She could try to de-escalate the situation by apologizing and backing down, but she sensed that Reed was too invested in making an example of her now to accept a simple capitulation. Or she could continue to stand her ground and hope that their unwillingness to cross certain lines would eventually force them to back off. "I'm not looking for trouble with any of you," Sarah said, trying to inject a note of calm reasonableness into her voice. "I understand that there are unofficial traditions here, and I respect that. But I also have a right to use the facilities that are available to all cadets. Can't we find a way to resolve this without it turning into something bigger?" Reed's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Oh, Martinez, you still don't get it, do you? This isn't about finding a resolution. This is about learning your place in the hierarchy. Every class of new cadets has to learn this lesson, and usually they learn it early and without too much drama. But you've been stubborn, haven't you? You've been thinking that if you just keep your head down and work hard, we'll eventually leave you alone." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "But that's not how it works. The harder you resist, the more attention you draw to yourself, and the more attention you draw, the more creative we have to get in teaching you proper respect." Brooks, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, suddenly produced something from his jacket pocket. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized it was a pistol, the kind that cadets used in their weapons training courses. Her mind immediately began cataloging the possibilities, Was it loaded with blanks? Was it completely unloaded? Or was there actual ammunition in the weapon? Now this changes things a bit, doesn't it? Brooks said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He held the weapon casually, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the group. David brought along a little insurance for our late-night activities. Sarah felt her mouth go dry as she stared at the gun. Even if it was loaded only with blanks, weapons were serious business at the academy. Unauthorized possession of firearms outside of official training exercises was grounds for immediate expulsion, not to mention potential criminal charges. The fact that Brooks was willing to risk that level of consequences suggested that this situation was more serious than she had initially realized. "That's not necessary," she said, her voice betraying the first hint of real fear since the confrontation began. "Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. I understand that you want me to show more respect for academy traditions." Reed's eyes lit up with satisfaction at the change in Sarah's tone. "Now we're getting somewhere," he said. "I think our little mouse is finally beginning to understand the seriousness of her situation. But unfortunately, Martinez, understanding isn't enough at this point. You've pushed this too far to just apologize and walk away." Kumar, who had been standing slightly apart from the others, shifted uncomfortably. Sarah could see doubt in his expression, as if he was beginning to question whether this was going too far. But he made no move to intervene or speak up against what was happening. "Here's what's going to happen," Reed announced, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when giving orders. "You're going to get down on your hands and knees right here on this floor. Then you're going to clean up this mess you made when you dropped your tray. And while you're doing that, you're going to recite the Cadet Honor Code 50 times. When you're finished with that, maybe we'll discuss what other lessons you need to learn." Sarah looked down at the spilled food and milk, the broken pieces of ceramic scattered across the floor. The sight of the waste made her angry all over again, not just because of the food that was now ruined, but because of the symbolic nature of the act. Reed had destroyed her meal as a show of power, and now he wanted her to debase herself by cleaning it up while surrounded by his laughing followers. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Brooks raised the pistol slightly, still not pointing it directly at her but making the threat clear. "Well, let's just say that would be an unwise decision. We wouldn't want you to have an accident, would we? Military training can be dangerous, and sometimes people get hurt when they don't follow proper safety protocols." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah realized that she was facing a decision that would define not just her time at the academy, but possibly the rest of her life. She could submit to their demands, accepting the humiliation and hoping that it would satisfy their need to dominate her. But she knew from experience that bullies rarely stopped at just one victory. If she gave in now, it would only invite more elaborate and degrading demands in the future. Alternatively, she could continue to resist and risk escalating the situation to a point where someone could actually get hurt. The presence of the weapon changed the equation dramatically, introducing the possibility of real violence into what had started as a psychological intimidation campaign. But there was a third option, one that required more courage than either submission or escalation. She could call their bluff, betting that even in their desire to humiliate her, they wouldn't cross the line into actual violence. It was a dangerous gamble, but Sarah had been observing these cadets for months, and she didn't believe they were truly capable of seriously harming another student. "You know what?" Sarah said, straightening her shoulders and looking Reed directly in the eye. "I don't think you have the guts to actually use that weapon. I think this is all just theater designed to scare me into compliance, but I'm not scared anymore." The effect of her words was electric. Reed's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, and something that might have been respect, before settling on cold determination. Brooks's hand tightened on the pistol, and Morrison took a step closer, his fists clenched and ready. "You think this is theater?" Reed asked, his voice deadly quiet. "You think we're just playing games here?" "I think you're bullies," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I think you've spent so much time pushing around people who won't fight back that you've forgotten what real strength looks like. And I think that deep down, you know that what you're doing is wrong." Hartwell laughed harshly. "Listen to her trying to psychoanalyze us. Maybe we should add a psychology lesson to her education tonight." But Sarah pressed on, sensing that her words were having an effect, even if it wasn't the one she had hoped for. "You want to know what I think the real problem is? I think you're all terrified. terrified that if you don't maintain this artificial hierarchy through fear and intimidation, people might realize that you're not actually any better than the rest of us, that your rank and your family connections don't make you superior human beings. Reed's hand shot out and grabbed Sarah by the front of her uniform, yanking her forward until their faces were inches apart. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed. "You know nothing about what it takes to lead, what it takes to maintain order and discipline in a place like this." "I know enough to recognize abuse when I see it," Sarah shot back, her fear now completely overwhelmed by righteous anger. "And I know that real leaders don't need to threaten people with weapons to get respect. They earn it through their actions and their character." Brooks moved closer, raising the pistol to point it more directly at Sarah. "Maybe it's time to show her just how real this situation is," he said, his voice tight with excitement. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she found herself staring down the barrel of a gun for the first time in her life. Even if the weapon was loaded with blanks, it could still cause serious injury at close range. But something inside her refused to back down, even in the face of this ultimate threat. "Go ahead," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "Pull the trigger. Show everyone what kind of people you really are. Show them that the great Marcus Reed and his followers are nothing more than cowards who threaten women with guns when they don't get their way." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant sounds from the kitchen seemed to fade away, leaving only the harsh breathing of the 6 cadets and the pounding of Sarah's heart. She could see the uncertainty in Brooks's eyes, the way his hand trembled slightly as he held the weapon. She could see Kumar taking an involuntary step backward, as if he was suddenly realizing how far things had escalated. But most importantly, she could see something in Reed's expression that she had never seen before: doubt. For the first time since she had known him, the supreme confidence that he wore like armor seemed to crack, revealing something vulnerable and uncertain underneath. "You're insane," Chen said, his voice barely audible. "You're absolutely insane." Sarah turned to look at him, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Am I? Or am I just tired of living in fear? Tired of letting people like you control my life through threats and intimidation? Maybe what looks like insanity to you is actually the first sign of sanity I've shown since I got here." Morrison stepped forward, clearly intending to grab Sarah and force her into compliance, but Reed held up a hand to stop him. The senior cadet was staring at Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You really aren't going to back down, are you?" Reed asked. And for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity rather than mere anger. "No," Sarah said simply. "I'm not. You can humiliate me, you can threaten me, you can even shoot me if that's what you've decided to do. But I'm not going to kneel down and clean up that mess while you laugh at me. And I'm not going to pretend to respect people who don't deserve it." The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out on Reed's face as he wrestled with a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. She could see Brooks wavering, the pistol now shaking noticeably in his grip. She could see the other cadets looking between their leader and her, waiting for someone to make the next move. And then, in a moment that would be burned into Sarah's memory forever, Brooks made his decision. Instead of lowering the weapon or stepping back, he pressed the barrel of the pistol directly against Sarah's temple. "Last chance, Martinez," he said, his voice cracking with tension. "Get on your knees and start cleaning, or I swear I'll pull this trigger." Time seemed to freeze as Sarah felt the cold metal of the gun barrel pressed against her temple. The weight of the weapon, the slight tremor in Brooks's hand, the rapid breathing of everyone in the circle around her, all of it crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. This was it. This was the moment that would define not just her future at the academy, but the kind of person she would be for the rest of her life. In that instant of perfect stillness, Sarah's mind became preternaturally calm. The fear that had been clawing at her chest suddenly evaporated, replaced by something she had never experienced before, a complete absence of doubt about what she needed to do. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, her breathing deepening, as if her body was preparing itself for whatever came next. "David," Reed said, his voice uncertain for the first time since Sarah had known him. "Maybe we should back off here. This is getting out of hand." But Brooks shook his head, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the dining hall. "No way. She needs to learn. They all need to learn that we're serious about maintaining discipline around here. If we let her walk away now, every junior cadet on this base will think they can disrespect us. Sarah could feel the tension radiating from the gun pressed against her head. Brooks was scared, she realized. Scared of backing down in front of his peers, scared of losing face, scared of admitting that he had taken things too far. That fear made him more dangerous than any amount of genuine malice would have. "You're right," Sarah said quietly, her voice so calm it seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. "Everyone does need to learn something tonight, but I don't think it's the lesson you intended to teach." She turned her head slightly, looking directly into Brooks's eyes despite the gun barrel that remained pressed against her temple. What she saw there wasn't the cold determination of a killer, but the desperate panic of a young man who had painted himself into a corner with no graceful way out. "You want to know what I learned about leadership from my brother?" Sarah continued, her voice still unnaturally steady. "He told me that the moment you have to threaten someone with violence to get them to respect you, you've already lost their respect forever. Real leaders don't need weapons to make their point." "Shut up," Brooks hissed, pressing the gun harder against her head. "Just shut up and do what you're told." But Sarah kept talking, her words directed not just at Brooks but at all of them. "I also learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. And right now, I'm more terrified than I've ever been in my life. But I'm not going to let that fear control my actions." Kumar finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Come on, guys, this has gone far enough. Let's just call it a night and walk away. Nobody needs to get hurt here." "Stay back, Alex," Reed warned, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Sarah could see the doubt spreading through the group like a contagion, each member beginning to question whether they really wanted to be part of whatever was about to happen. Morrison, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly spoke up. "She's right, you know. This isn't what leaders do. This is what cowards do when they can't get their way through legitimate means." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Morrison had been one of Reed's most reliable followers, someone who could always be counted on to support the senior cadets' decisions without question. His defection represented a crack in the foundation of Reed's authority that couldn't be ignored. "Jake, what the hell are you saying?" Hartwell demanded, her voice shrill with disbelief. "Are you seriously taking her side over ours?" Morrison's massive frame seemed to deflate slightly as he looked around at his companions. "I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying that this isn't who I want to be. My father served in Vietnam and he taught me that honor means something. This," he gestured at the scene around them, "this isn't honorable." Brooks's hand was shaking more violently now, and Sarah could feel the gun barrel trembling against her skin. She realized that his finger was probably on the trigger, and that any sudden movement or loud noise could result in an accidental discharge. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it only strengthened her resolve. "David," she said softly, using his first name for the first time, "I don't think you really want to hurt me. I think you're a basically decent person who got caught up in something that spiraled out of control. It's not too late to step back from this." "You don't know anything about me," Brooks replied, but his voice was cracking with emotion. "You don't know what kind of pressure I'm under, what my family expects from me." Sarah nodded slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You're right, I don't know your story, but I know that whatever pressure you're feeling, it's not worth destroying your life over, because that's what will happen if you pull that trigger. Your military career will be over before it starts. Your family will be devastated. And for what? To prove a point to some junior cadet who was just trying to get something to eat." Reed had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that he was losing control of the situation. "Brooks, don't listen to her. She's trying to manipulate you, trying to make you look weak in front of everyone." But Sarah pressed on, sensing that she was making progress. "The only weakness I see here is the inability to admit when you've made a mistake. And everyone makes mistakes, David. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's how they handle them when they realize they've gone too far." Tears were now streaming down Brooks's face, though his grip on the weapon remained firm. "I can't back down now," he whispered. "If I back down, I'll look like a coward." "No," Sarah said firmly. "If you back down, you'll look like someone who has the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult. That's not cowardice, David. That's leadership." Chen, who had been growing more agitated as the confrontation continued, suddenly exploded. "Enough of this psychological manipulation crap. Brooks, either shoot her or let's get out of here." We're wasting time arguing with someone who's obviously unstable. His words seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the group in check. Brooks's grip on the weapon tightened, and Sarah could see his knuckles whitening as he prepared to make his final decision. Reed stepped forward, clearly intending to take control of the situation before it deteriorated further. But it was Kumar who surprised everyone by grabbing Brooks's wrist and forcing the gun away from Sarah's head. "No!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty dining hall. "This stops now. I won't be part of this anymore." The two cadets struggled for control of the weapon, their grunts and curses breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the scene. Sarah backed away quickly, finally able to put some distance between herself and the immediate danger. Morrison moved to help Kumar, his larger frame easily overpowering Brooks and forcing him to release his grip on the pistol. The gun clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. For a moment, everyone stared at the weapon as if it were a poisonous snake that might strike at any moment. Then Reed lunged forward, clearly intending to retrieve it, but Sarah was closer and faster. Her hand closed around the grip of the pistol just as Reed's fingers brushed the barrel. She rolled away from him, coming up in a crouch with the weapon pointed at the floor between them. The tables had turned in an instant, and now she was the one holding all the cards. "Sarah, give me the gun," Reed said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that she had never heard before. "Come on, this is crazy. You don't want to make this situation any worse than it already is." Sarah looked down at the weapon in her hands, nodding with detached interest that it was indeed loaded with live ammunition. The safety was off, and there was a round in the chamber. Brooks had been fully prepared to kill her if she continued to resist. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Actually, Marcus, I think I do want to make this worse," she said, her voice regaining the strength and confidence that had characterized her earlier defiance. "I think it's time that someone in authority found out exactly what kind of discipline you've been maintaining around here." She stood slowly, keeping the gun pointed safely toward the floor but maintaining a grip that suggested she knew how to use it if necessary. Her father had taken her hunting as a child, and she was comfortable with firearms in a way that many of her fellow cadets were not. "You can't be serious," Hartwell said, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Sarah, think about what you're doing. If you report this, all of us will be expelled. Our military careers will be over before they start." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's true, Lisa. Your careers probably will be over, but maybe that's for the best. Maybe people who threaten other students with loaded weapons shouldn't be officers in the United States military." Brooks had collapsed into one of the dining hall chairs, his head in his hands as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. "My father is going to kill me," he moaned. 20 years of military service, and his son gets kicked out for threatening a fellow cadet with a gun. "You should have thought about that before you pressed this thing against my head," Sarah replied, though there was no malice in her voice. She actually felt sorry for Brooks, recognizing that he was as much a victim of the toxic culture at the academy as she was. Morrison had moved to stand beside Kumar, both cadets clearly aligning themselves with Sarah now that the immediate danger had passed. "What do you want us to do?" Morrison asked. "We'll support whatever decision you make." Sarah looked around the group, studying each face carefully. Reed was trying to maintain his composure, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Hartwell was calculating frantically, probably trying to figure out if there was any way to spin the situation to her advantage. Chen was edging toward the exit, clearly preparing to run if given the opportunity. Brooks remained slumped in his chair, the picture of defeat and despair. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah announced, her voice taking on a tone of authority that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. "We're all going to walk out of here together, and we're going to report this incident to the duty officer immediately. We're going to tell them exactly what happened, with no lies and no attempts to minimize anyone's role in this situation." "Sarah, please," Reed started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'm not finished. After we report to the duty officer, we're going to wait together until the investigators arrive. We're going to give them complete and truthful statements about everything that happened here tonight, and then we're going to accept whatever consequences come from our actions." She paused, looking directly at each of them in turn. "I want to be very clear about something. I'm not doing this out of revenge or because I want to see any of you suffer. I'm doing this because what happened here tonight was wrong, and pretending it didn't happen would be even more wrong. People need to be held accountable for their choices, especially people who want to be military officers. Kumar nodded slowly. She's right. We all knew this was getting out of hand, and most of us did nothing to stop it until it was almost too late. We need to face up to what we did. Morrison agreed. I've been thinking about my father and what he would say if he knew I was part of something like this. He didn't fight for his country so that his son could threaten innocent people with weapons. But Chen shook his head vehemently. This is insane. Sarah, if you report this, you're destroying 6 people's lives over what was essentially a prank that got a little out of hand. Is that really what you want on your conscience? Sarah considered the question seriously before responding. Tommy, what happened here tonight wasn't a prank. A prank is putting plastic wrap over a toilet seat or short-sheeting someone's bed. What happened here was assault with a deadly weapon, and probably several other crimes that I don't even know the names of. If we don't report it, what message does that send to the next group of cadets who decide to take their hazing a little too far? She moved toward the exit, still carrying the pistol but keeping it pointed safely downward. I'm going to the duty officer now. Anyone who wants to come with me and tell the truth about what happened is welcome to join me. Anyone who wants to run away and hope this never comes to light is free to make that choice. But understand that I will be telling the complete truth about everyone who was here tonight, regardless of whether you're there to speak for yourselves. Reed made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Sarah, wait. Let's talk about this rationally. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement that doesn't have to involve the authorities. Maybe some community service or extra training duties or something like that. Sarah stopped and turned back to face him, her expression sad but determined. Marcus, the time for working things out privately was before David pressed a loaded gun against my head. Once that line was crossed, this stopped being something we could handle internally. She resumed walking toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the empty dining hall. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the other cadets making their own decisions about whether to follow her or try to salvage their situations through other means. As she reached the door, Sarah paused and looked back one more time. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope that someday you'll understand that I'm not doing this to hurt any of you. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do and because someone needs to have the courage to speak up when things go wrong. With that, she pushed through the door and out into the cold night air, leaving behind the wreckage of what had started as a simple quest for food and had become something far more significant. She had no way of knowing it at the time, but her decision to stand up to Reed and his followers would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own life, but the entire culture of the academy. The walk to the duty officer's station felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. Each step echoed through the empty corridors of the base, and she found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every detail of her surroundings. The weight of the pistol in her hand served as a constant reminder of how close she had come to serious injury or death, and how dramatically her life was about to change. Behind her, she could hear footsteps. She turned to see Morrison and Kumar following at a distance, their faces grave but determined. A few seconds later, Brooks emerged from the dining facility, walking unsteadily but clearly committed to facing whatever consequences awaited him. Reed and Chen were nowhere to be seen, and Sarah found herself wondering if they had chosen to run or if they were simply taking a different route to avoid being seen together. The duty officer's station was located in the main administrative building, an imposing structure that housed the academy's command staff during regular hours. At night, it served as the nerve center for base security and emergency response, staffed by a rotating crew of senior cadets and commissioned officers who handled everything from medical emergencies to disciplinary issues. As Sarah approached the building, she could see lights on in the second-floor windows where the duty staff maintained their overnight vigil. The sight of those lights filled her with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because she was finally going to be able to tell someone in authority what had happened, and apprehension because she knew that once she walked through those doors, there would be no going back. Staff Sergeant Williams was on duty that night, a career military man who had seen enough of academy life to handle most situations with calm professionalism. He looked up from his paperwork as Sarah entered the office, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention as he noticed the weapon in her hands and the serious expressions on the faces of the cadets behind her. "What's going on here, Cadet Martinez?" Williams asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. "And why are you carrying that sidearm outside of authorized training exercises?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would set everything in motion. "Sergeant Williams, I need to report an incident that just occurred in the main dining facility. Several senior cadets threatened me with this weapon, and I believe formal charges need to be filed." Williams's eyebrows shot up at her words. This was clearly not the type of routine disciplinary issue he typically handled during overnight shifts. He reached for his phone, likely to contact his superior officers, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Before you make any calls, Sergeant, there are more cadets who were involved in this incident. Some of them may be arriving shortly to provide their own statements. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to tell their version of what happened." The duty officer nodded slowly, his training taking over as he began to process the situation according to established protocols. "All right, Martinez, first things first, I need you to carefully place that weapon on my desk. Then I want you to sit down and give me a preliminary account of what occurred." Sarah complied, gently setting the pistol on the desk where Williams could secure it. The moment the weapon left her hands, she felt a strange combination of relief and vulnerability. She had been holding on to it for less than 10 minutes, but it had become a symbol of her newfound determination to stand up for herself and others. Morrison, Kumar, and Brooks took seats in the outer office while Sarah began her account of the evening's events. She started with her decision to visit the dining facility and worked chronologically through the confrontation, being careful to include specific details about who said what and when. Williams listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing her to tell her story without interruption. As she spoke, Sarah found herself reliving the terror and anger she had felt during the confrontation. But she also discovered something unexpected in her recounting of events, a sense of pride in how she had handled herself under extreme pressure. Despite being outnumbered and ultimately threatened with a deadly weapon, she had never backed down from her principles or allowed fear to dictate her actions. When she finished her initial statement, Williams set down his pen and looked at her seriously. "Cadet Martinez, what you're describing constitutes several serious violations of military law and academy regulations. Are you absolutely certain about the accuracy of your account? Because once I make the required notifications, this is going to become a formal investigation that will have significant consequences for everyone involved." Sarah nodded without hesitation. "I understand the seriousness of the situation, Sergeant. Everything I've told you is exactly what happened. I have no desire to exaggerate or embellish the facts, but I also won't minimize what occurred." Williams stood up and moved to his communications equipment. "I need to notify the officer of the day, the commandant's office, and the military police. This type of incident requires immediate investigation by properly trained personnel." He paused and looked back at Sarah. "I also need to ask if you require medical attention. Were you physically harmed in any way during this incident?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She had no visible injuries, and the gun had never actually been fired. But she was beginning to realize that the psychological impact of having a loaded weapon pressed to her head might be something that required professional attention. "I don't think I need immediate medical care," she replied. "But I might want to speak with someone about the psychological effects of what happened once things settled down." Williams nodded approvingly. "That's a mature decision, Martinez. Traumatic experiences can have delayed effects that aren't immediately apparent. I'll make sure that counseling resources are made available to you." As Williams began making his phone calls, Sarah heard voices in the hallway outside the office. She looked through the window to see Reed and Chen approaching, both looking like men walking to their own executions. Hartwell was with them, her usual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. The three cadets entered the outer office and took seats near the others, creating an awkward tableau of young people waiting to learn their fates. The silence was thick with tension and unspoken recriminations, but Sarah noticed that none of them were looking at each other. Everyone seemed to be focused on their own internal struggles with what was about to happen. Williams finished his calls and returned to his desk, where he began documenting the weapon and other evidence from the scene. "The officer of the day will be here within the next 15 minutes, he announced to the group. "Major Harrison from the military police is en route, along with investigators from the Criminal Investigation Division. Each of you will be interviewed separately and asked to provide a written statement about tonight's events." Brooks raised his hand tentatively. "Sergeant, what's going to happen to us? I mean, what kind of punishment are we looking at for something like this?" Williams's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. "That's not for me to determine, Cadet Brooks, but I will tell you that threatening another service member with a deadly weapon is a serious offense under both military law and civilian criminal statutes. At minimum, you're looking at expulsion from the academy and possible court-martial proceedings." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Sarah could see the color drain from several faces as the full implications of their situation became clear. These weren't just academy disciplinary measures they were facing, but potentially life-altering criminal charges that could follow them for years to come. Kumar spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is there any chance that cooperation with the investigation might be taken into account during sentencing? Some of us tried to stop what was happening once we realized how serious things had gotten." Williams considered the question carefully before responding. "Cooperation is always viewed favorably by investigating officers and military judges. But you need to understand that this isn't a situation where anyone is going to walk away without consequences. The question is whether those consequences will be career-ending or just career-damaging." The next few minutes passed in uncomfortable silence as the group waited for the investigators to arrive. Sarah found herself studying the faces of her fellow cadets, trying to understand how they were processing what had happened. Morrison looked resigned but somehow relieved, as if he was finally free from the burden of participating in something he knew was wrong. Kumar appeared to be deep in thought, probably rehearsing what he would say during his interview. Reed sat apart from the others, his usual commanding presence reduced to something smaller and more vulnerable. Sarah realized that this night had probably been as traumatic for him as it had been for her, though for very different reasons. His entire identity was built around being a leader and a role model, and now he was facing the possibility that his military career was over before it had really begun. Brooks was crying quietly, his shoulders shaking with the effort of trying to maintain some semblance of composure. Sarah felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for him, recognizing that he was probably the most frightened person in the room. He had been the one holding the weapon, which made him the primary focus of any criminal charges that might be filed. Chen and Hartwell sat together, whispering occasionally in voices too low for anyone else to hear. Sarah suspected they were trying to coordinate their stories, but she hoped they would ultimately decide to tell the truth about what had happened. The investigation would undoubtedly uncover any significant discrepancies between witness accounts, and lying to military investigators would only make their situations worse. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of the investigative team. Major Harrison entered first, a tall woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with serious military crimes. She was followed by two Criminal Investigation Division agents, both in civilian clothes but clearly experienced in handling sensitive cases. "Ladies and gentlemen," Major Harrison announced, her voice carrying easily through both the inner and outer offices. "I'm Major Harrison, and I'll be supervising the investigation into tonight's incident. Agent Martinez and Agent Johnson will be conducting the individual interviews, and I want to make several things clear before we begin." She paused, making eye contact with each cadet in turn. "First, you are all considered both witnesses and potential subjects in this investigation. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to have an attorney present during questioning. However, I strongly encourage you to cooperate fully with this investigation, as your level of cooperation will be noted in any subsequent proceedings." Agent Martinez, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanor, stepped forward. "We'll be conducting interviews in separate rooms to ensure that each person has the opportunity to provide their account without influence from others. The interviews will be recorded, and you'll be asked to sign written statements summarizing your testimony." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and nervousness as the formal investigation got underway. She was grateful that trained professionals were now handling the situation, but she was also aware that the next few hours would be crucial in determining not just her own future, but the futures of everyone who had been in that dining hall. Agent Johnson, a younger woman with short blonde hair and an efficient manner, began organizing the interview schedule. "We'll start with Cadet Martinez, since she was the one who reported the incident. The rest of you will wait here under Sergeant Williams's supervision until you're called." As Sarah stood to follow Agent Johnson to the interview room, she looked back at her fellow cadets one more time. Despite everything that had happened, she found herself hoping that they would all find the courage to tell the truth about what had occurred. The investigation would be difficult for everyone involved, but it was the only way to ensure that similar incidents didn't happen to future cadets. The interview room was small and sterile, containing only a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device. Agent Johnson activated the recorder and began the formal questioning, asking Sarah to state her name, rank, and academy identification number for the record. Then she launched into a detailed examination of the evening's events, asking follow-up questions about specific details and requesting clarification on points that seemed unclear. Sarah found the process both exhausting and cathartic. For the first time since the confrontation began, she was able to tell her story to someone who was trained to listen objectively and who had the authority to do something meaningful about what had happened. Agent Johnson was thorough but respectful, never making Sarah feel like she was the one being investigated rather than the one filing a complaint. The interview lasted for nearly 2 hours, covering not just the events of that evening, but also the pattern of harassment and intimidation that had led up to the confrontation. Agent Johnson was particularly interested in Sarah's documentation efforts, asking to see the journal where she had recorded previous incidents involving Reed and his followers. "This level of detail is very helpful," Agent Johnson noted as she reviewed Sarah's carefully maintained records. "It shows a pattern of escalating behavior that provides important context for what happened tonight. Have you shared this information with any Academy officials prior to tonight?" Sarah shook her head. "I was planning to file a formal complaint once I had enough evidence to make a strong case. I was worried that reporting isolated incidents without clear proof would just result in retaliation without any meaningful consequences for the people involved." Agent Johnson nodded understandingly. "That's a common concern among victims of harassment and hazing. Unfortunately, it also means that behavior often escalates to dangerous levels before anyone intervenes. Your decision to document everything may have prevented similar incidents from occurring in the future." As the interview concluded, Sarah felt both drained and oddly empowered. She had told her story completely and honestly, holding nothing back and making no attempt to minimize or exaggerate what had occurred. Whatever happened next, she knew that she had done everything possible to ensure that the truth would be revealed. "Thank you for your cooperation, Cadet Martinez," Agent Johnson said as they prepared to leave the interview room. "This has been very helpful, and I want you to know that your courage in reporting this incident may have prevented much more serious harm from occurring to other cadets." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For months, she had been dealing with harassment and intimidation largely on her own, afraid to trust anyone with the full scope of what she was experiencing. Now, finally, the burden of proof and the responsibility for action had been transferred to people who were trained and authorized to handle such situations. As she returned to the outer office to wait while the other interviews were conducted, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. There would be more questions, more investigations, and undoubtedly more difficult conversations in the days and weeks to come. But for the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she wasn't facing those challenges alone. The investigation that followed Sarah's report would become one of the most comprehensive examinations of cadet culture in the academy's history. What began as an inquiry into a single incident of threatened violence quickly expanded into a broader investigation of systematic hazing, abuse of power, and failure of institutional oversight that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Agent Johnson and Agent Martinez worked methodically through the case, interviewing not only the cadets who had been present that night, but dozens of other students who came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. Sarah's detailed journal became a roadmap for understanding how toxic behavior had been allowed to flourish unchecked, and her courage in speaking up inspired others to break their own silence. The interviews with the other cadets from that night revealed a complex web of motivations, fears, and institutional pressures that had contributed to the escalation of violence. Reed, when finally faced with the full weight of the evidence against him, chose to cooperate fully with investigators. His testimony revealed that the harassment of junior cadets had been not just tolerated, but actively encouraged by some senior academy staff members who viewed it as a necessary part of military character development. Brooks proved to be the most challenging witness for investigators to handle. His emotional state remained fragile throughout the questioning process, and he required several breaks during his interview as he struggled to articulate what had driven him to press a loaded weapon against another cadet's head. His testimony revealed a young man under enormous pressure from family expectations and academy culture, someone who had lost sight of basic human decency in his desperate need to fit in with his peer group. Morrison and Kumar's cooperation was instrumental in helping investigators understand the group dynamics that had allowed the situation to escalate so dramatically. Both cadets provided detailed accounts of previous incidents involving Reed's group, and their willingness to testify against their former associates demonstrated the kind of moral courage that military leaders were supposed to exemplify. Chen initially attempted to minimize his role in the incident, claiming that he had been present but not actively participating in the threatening behavior. However, testimony from other witnesses and evidence from Academy security cameras eventually forced him to acknowledge his full participation in the harassment and intimidation that had preceded the weapon threat. Hartwell's interview proved particularly revealing about the culture of silence that had protected abusive behavior at the Academy. She admitted to investigators that she had witnessed numerous incidents of hazing and harassment over her time as a senior cadet, but had never reported them because she feared retaliation and because she believed such behavior was simply part of Academy tradition. The criminal investigation moved forward on multiple tracks simultaneously. Military prosecutors began building cases against each of the cadets involved, while Academy administrators launched their own internal investigation into systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to flourish. The FBI became involved when it became clear that some of the incidents under investigation potentially violated federal civil rights laws. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm as news of the investigation leaked to outside press organizations. Initially, Academy officials tried to keep the story contained within military channels, but the severity of the allegations and the potential for criminal charges made secrecy impossible. National news organizations picked up the story, and Sarah's name became associated with broader conversations about hazing, military culture, and institutional reform. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had simply been trying to get something to eat on a quiet night. Sarah's parents flew in from Texas to provide support, and the Academy provided her with counseling services to help her cope with both the trauma of the original incident and the stress of being thrust into the public spotlight. Despite the challenges, she remained committed to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion. The first significant development came 3 weeks after the incident, when Brooks was formally charged with assault with a deadly weapon under both military law and Colorado state criminal statutes. The charges carried the possibility of several years in prison and automatic expulsion from the Academy. Brooks's family hired expensive civilian attorneys to supplement his military defense counsel, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Reed faced charges of conspiracy to commit assault and failure to prevent the commission of a crime by subordinates under his supervision. While not as serious as the charges against Brooks, the accusations were still career-ending for someone who had hoped to follow in his father's footsteps as a military officer. The scandal also tainted his family's military legacy, something that seemed to affect him more deeply than his own legal troubles. Chen and Hartwell were charged with lesser offenses related to their participation in the harassment and intimidation campaign, but they still faced expulsion and potential criminal penalties. Both accepted plea agreements that required them to testify truthfully about the culture of abuse at the Academy in exchange for reduced sentences. Morrison and Kumar, because of their efforts to stop the escalation of violence and their full cooperation with investigators, faced only administrative punishment from the Academy. Both were required to repeat their current academic year and undergo extensive counseling, but they were allowed to remain in the program and eventually graduate with their classes. The broader institutional investigation revealed systemic problems that went far beyond the actions of a few individual cadets. Several senior Academy staff members were found to have actively encouraged hazing behavior, viewing it as character building rather than recognizing it as abuse. The Academy's reporting mechanisms for harassment and assault were found to be inadequate, often serving to protect perpetrators rather than victims. Sarah's detailed documentation proved to be crucial not just in prosecuting the specific case against Reed's group, but in identifying patterns of abuse that had affected dozens of other cadets over the years. Her journal entries provided investigators with names, dates, and specific incidents that allowed them to build comprehensive cases against multiple offenders who had previously operated with impunity. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the military justice system, but the academy administrators acted quickly to implement reforms designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The commandant was replaced, along with several other senior officers who had failed to address known problems with cadet culture. New reporting mechanisms were established, with independent oversight to ensure that complaints would be investigated thoroughly and fairly. Sarah was invited to participate in the development of new training programs designed to educate cadets about proper leadership behavior and the legal consequences of harassment and hazing. Her input was particularly valuable because she could speak from personal experience about the impact such behavior had on victims and the institutional factors that allowed it to flourish. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Changing institutional culture is always a slow and difficult process, and there were some cadets and staff members who resisted the new policies and procedures. But Sarah's courage in speaking up had created a momentum for change that became increasingly difficult to ignore or suppress. Brooks ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 18 months in military prison, followed by a dishonorable discharge from the service. His military career was over, but his cooperation with investigators and his genuine remorse for his actions helped him avoid the lengthy federal prison sentence he might otherwise have faced. Reed's case proved more complex because of his family's political connections and his own claims that he had been following unofficial academy traditions rather than engaging in criminal behavior. However, the evidence of his leadership role in systematic harassment was overwhelming, and he eventually accepted a plea agreement that resulted in his dismissal from the academy and a suspended jail sentence contingent on completing community service and anger management counseling. Chen and Hartwell both received administrative separations from the academy and probationary sentences that allowed them to avoid jail time in exchange for community service and participation in anti-bullying programs. Both struggled to find direction after leaving the military, but neither was charged with criminal offenses related to their participation in the harassment campaign. The changes at the academy extended far beyond personnel replacements and policy modifications. The culture began to shift as new classes of cadets arrived to find an environment where harassment and hazing were not only officially prohibited, but actively discouraged by peer pressure and institutional expectations. Sarah's story became part of the curriculum, taught as an example of the kind of moral courage that military leaders were expected to demonstrate. Sarah herself faced a difficult decision about whether to remain at the academy after everything that had happened. The trauma of the original incident, combined with the stress of the investigation and media attention, had taken a significant toll on her mental and physical health. She considered transferring to a civilian university where she could pursue her engineering studies without the constant reminders of what she had experienced. But after extensive counseling and conversations with family members and academy officials, Sarah decided to stay and complete her military education. She felt that leaving would send the wrong message to other potential victims of harassment, and she wanted to be part of the solution rather than simply walking away from the problems she had helped expose. Her decision proved to be the right one. Sarah not only completed her studies successfully, but became a leader in efforts to maintain the cultural changes that had been implemented in response to her case. She served on committees that reviewed harassment complaints, participated in new cadet orientation programs, and mentored younger students who faced challenges similar to those she had experienced. The academic work that had originally driven her to the dining hall that fateful night was completed successfully, earning her one of the highest grades in her engineering program. The incident had cost her sleep and peace of mind, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. Her professors noted that her work became even more focused and innovative after the confrontation, as if the experience of standing up for herself had freed her to pursue excellence without fear. Sarah graduated from the academy with honors 4 years after the incident, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. Her commissioning ceremony was attended by dozens of cadets who credited her courage with making the academy a safer and more welcoming place for everyone. Several gave speeches about how her example had inspired them to speak up about problems they witnessed or experienced. The changes Sarah's courage had initiated continued to evolve long after her graduation. Annual surveys showed dramatic improvements in cadet satisfaction and reports of harassment incidents. The academy became a model for other military institutions struggling with similar cultural problems, and Sarah was often invited to speak at conferences about leadership, courage, and institutional change. Brooks, after serving his sentence and receiving treatment for the psychological issues that had contributed to his actions, eventually found work as a counselor for young people struggling with anger and violence issues. He credited Sarah's courage in standing up to him with saving not only her own life, but his as well, preventing him from crossing a line that would have destroyed multiple lives, including his own. Reed struggled more with the aftermath of the incident, finding it difficult to rebuild his identity after the collapse of his military career aspirations. He eventually found work in the private sector, but he continued to struggle with depression and anger related to the consequences of his actions. In later interviews, he acknowledged that Sarah had done the right thing in reporting the incident, even though it had cost him everything he had hoped to achieve. Morrison and Kumar both graduated from the academy and went on to successful military careers, often crediting the lessons they learned from the incident with making them better officers and leaders. Both maintained contact with Sarah over the years, and all three remained committed to ensuring that the changes they had helped bring about would be permanent rather than temporary. The incident in the dining hall lasted less than an hour, but its effects continued to ripple through the academy and the broader military community for years afterward. Sarah's decision to stand her ground against intimidation and violence had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless other cadets who would benefit from the cultural changes her courage had made possible. 10 years later, as a major in the Army Corps of Engineers leading infrastructure projects around the world, Sarah still received letters from young military personnel who had heard her story and found inspiration in her example. She always responded with the same message that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right even when the consequences